Well, as always, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Ed Dusinberre to our space here, our virtual space. Ed, how are you?
I'm very well, and it's great to see you again.
Fantastic. So we're here to celebrate Beethoven because it has been deprived of us almost this entire year to take part in all these massive celebrations. And I'm guessing that the Takács Quartet had some significant plans that you've had to cancel. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like everyone, we've had to make tremendous changes and have been doing more in the way of video content for some of our loyal presenters, which has been a great sort of learning curve for us.
Totally, for me too.
Yeah, and one of the things that's funny about it, one of the recordings we made was actually of Beethoven 132, the whole piece, and usually first of all, it's quite unusual for a string quartet to get filmed, in my experience. I don't know, there are some wonderful films of the Tokyo Quartet. I remember particularly seeing one recently from Tokyo, but generally it's not something that happens every day. And certainly when it does happen, we've had no input in, which camera angles are used or how it looks. And so this has been a really new experience for us to actually have input. We've been working with a talented videographer here, and it's been fun. But of course, in a string quartet, there are like 6 different opinions for how it should look. So that's a whole different dimension that we've had to talk about.
Of course, we have to come to an agreement. I mean, that's one of the magical things about playing in a string quartet, right? Figuring out how to be one voice when essentially you have at least 4 ideas, right? That's assuming that each of us only has one.
Exactly.
Yeah, but anyway, that's also part of the magic of it, the tension. I find it always interesting when I look back and I see a film of us playing from maybe 30 years ago, and I kind of remember that there was a lot of tension, a lot of disagreement, and frustration that we couldn't play it the way we wanted to. And then later you look at it and say, my God, that seemed really unified, actually.
Yes, that's very interesting.
Right, and maybe some of that tension is in a funny way unifying.
Yes, because you have to work through it. Are there, when you think of that, are there particular pieces or contentious passages or things that every time you went to play them, you knew there was going to be conversation?
There was more, it was to do with a general thing. It was like a feeling of a tempo or something like that, because all musicians have particular tendencies when it comes to rhythm, right? I mean, some people are just born rushers, and in order to become really good professionals, they have to figure out how to resist that. But it's never entirely gone, right? Mm-hmm. And some people are born expanders, like the great conductor Celibidache, Mm-hmm. I mean, he never rushed a phrase in his entire life, right? So, and then everything in between, I think. So our conversations were usually about trying to come to terms with how the rhythm feels, because we talk about rhythm and it's not symmetry, right? Rhythm is flow.
Yes.
And so that's the thing, because it's flow, the degree to which you flow or the degree to which you allow space around the flow, these things are very intricate, and by the time we get to the stage, we better not make it look like we have friction.
Yes.
Right?
I mean, as I hear you saying that, I mean, I would have to categorize myself in the rusher department rather than the expander, and so the second movement of Opus 59 number 3 has always been a delicate negotiation in that slow movement, because I think Ondráš has our cellist has a very good sense that it's a piece that is so, repetition is a real feature of the character, this sort of kind of almost slightly numbed sadness that just keeps coming back. And I think he always sort of reminds us that we shouldn't fight that. We shouldn't feel like we have to make big events and big direction, and there's a quality of sort of an almost drugged quality to it, at least at the beginning. Of course, it changes later on. And sometimes in the past, I've been a little resistant to that, but now that I'm hopefully older and a bit wiser, but as he said, by the time you get to actually play it in a concert, you have to just agree. I mean, that's really important. And then it's in the rehearsals that the cans of worms get opened.
Sure. Well, I mean, you bring up a really important subject, which is, to what degree do we as musicians impose our own personality on a composer's work, rather than try to reflect what we truly believe the composer intended, and only adding the degree to which we have to add ourselves. I mean, George Shebok, who was the greatest teacher, he was a wonderful pianist, Hungarian, taught at Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
He said something which I always loved. He said, if I want to go on stage and play a Beethoven sonata, I have to disappear for 25 minutes because there's no room for both of us.
That's great.
And I love that. And I think, you see a lot of playing which we might consider rather indulgent. And on the other side, you might see some playing which you say, yeah, it's not expressive enough, right? They're not committing enough. And finding that balance, I mean, it's one of the reasons I love teaching, actually. And I know you do quite a bit of teaching as well. I think it really helps us understand how to formulate where to go. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. I was thinking, just as I was listening to you talk, just wondering if you have particular early experiences in the Tokyo Quartet around Beethoven, or even way before that. I mean, how did you first get hooked on Beethoven quartets?
I first got hooked on Beethoven piano sonatas because there were so many pianists in my house.
Yes.
And I mean, my father and my sister, at least. And, to listen to Opus 109 or Opus 111 or the Hammerklavier was just otherworldly, So I think that's what caught me. Funnily enough, I didn't play that many quartets. And I mean, I think we share that in common. Yes. You had a piano trio in England, right? Or
I played a quartet at the Royal College, but I didn't play a lot of quartets. You're absolutely right. And like you, my first experience with Beethoven was piano sonatas, because my grandfather, who was the registrar at the Royal College of Music, but he was a very good amateur pianist. And when he retired, he and my gran moved to Shropshire, and they had a little cottage there. And we frequently went on summer holidays there, and they had a lovely garden that, I'd go and play football with my brother, and quite often there'd be the sound of piano floating out in the garden. And he was a very modest man. He loved to play for himself. He didn't particularly love performing, but I think particularly my dad loved to listen to him play, and so was quite often pushing him, like, John, can you play? What are you working on right now? And eventually my grandfather sort of lost some of his shyness and ended up playing for us in the late afternoon. And I heard lots of piano sonatas, Beethoven piano sonatas, and yeah, it was a kind of magic to have them in one's system from that sort of early age, and also played by someone where his sense of wonder and delight, it wasn't anything about his personality. He wasn't a flashy player, and sometimes he'd just stop and point out a really great chord that he loved, and so that, it couldn't have been a better experience.
Now, you didn't get to college until about the mid 80s, late 80s?
86. Yeah.
86. Okay. So you're exactly, I think people know by now that we followed very a similar path. But you were about, more than a dozen years later, because you're more than a dozen years younger. Yeah. But it kind of always intrigues me that then you came to Juilliard, and then you joined a quartet with three people of a specific nationality who had been a quartet of one nationality, yours Hungarian, mine Japanese. So it's always intrigued me. But you asked me about falling in love. I bet the next thing you did with Beethoven was to play violin sonatas, I'm going to guess, maybe even with your grandfather.
We played the Spring Sonata. And actually, growing up in Cambridge, I was very lucky. I had a piano teacher, a woman called Hilda Bohr, who had been a child prodigy, and then when she was older, also played with the Amadeus quartets. But by the time that I was working with her, she was just teaching private students. She was a wonderful pianist, and she kindly, suffered my very crude first attempts with a couple of different Beethoven sonatas. I played the concerto much earlier than I should have done. Probably,
How old were you?
I was probably second year at college, so 18, 19. Of course, I wasn't ready for it, but I think it was still great just to play it, and I was lucky. I think I played it with my dad worked at the University of Warwick at that point, and I was lucky enough to play with their student symphony orchestra, and I think I played it with another orchestra put together by a conductor at college. I'm glad there isn't any sort of physical evidence of those performances, but you know,
I totally sympathize. I mean, that's funny. We never talked about this, but I played the Beethoven Concerto when I was 17 in public, which I also, I suppose, shouldn't have done. Although now we're really revealing our English background, aren't we? You know, you're too young man. You're not mature enough. I was recently speaking to Augustin Hardelich a little bit about this, you know, who's such a wonderful person, an incredible musician and violinist. And he told me that actually his father encouraged him to play everything. Play. He was playing Bartók's second violin concerto when he was like 10 or something. And it's very much the opposite of the way we grew up. You know, wait till your turn kind of thing, you know, wait till you're mature enough. But I bet that our experiences playing the Beethoven concerto at such a young age was really significant, right? Because the whole point is you have to get to know the person through his music, right? So that you have a strong identity with it, which certainly I felt that I was doing, so that when I did start playing the quartets, rather similarly probably to you, you felt like, okay, I can learn what this is about more quickly because I'm so familiar with his language, right?
Yes, exactly. And I also remember studying at the college with my teacher, Felix Andrievsky, getting to the extraordinary second page of the slow movement of the concerto with its sort of amazing, florid sense of improvisation and just the ethereal sense of maybe someone talking to God, or however you want to think of it. And my teacher was a very inspiring personality. And the first time I played it for him, I really didn't have any idea what was going on. And he didn't demonstrate very much, but I do remember him just playing the whole of that page for me. And I was in awe of both the beauty of what he was doing and also, but more his sense of sort of being in the room with this music that was so special, and I just needed to like wake up and get with the program, you know. So.
Absolutely. So, you know, what is it, do you think, that is so extraordinary about Beethoven? I know that's a very difficult question to answer because we could speak about that for hours or days even, but there is something unique about the way Beethoven makes us feel as human beings. I think even if you can't read music, or you have very little exposure to music, certain passages of Beethoven will grab everyone. It's incredibly universal. What are the things about Beethoven that you find so remarkable?
Well, yeah, I want to hear your answer to this question as well. Many things. I think the juxtapositions of mood and we were talking earlier about how our own personalities can't get in the way. He makes such emotional demands on the player in terms of the understanding of something that can be very ethereal in one moment and then rather sort of rude and down to earth. So that's one element. I think this amazing marrying of a very strong form and rhythm and structure and spine and solidity on the one hand, and tremendous strife and pushing against all of those things on the other hand. So I think maybe in a nutshell, especially as I've got older and life gets more complicated and you become more aware of contradictions and ambivalence and trying to balance different things, Beethoven speaks to that because he's so full of contradictions and different voices within the same piece, but somehow extraordinarily unified to be very convincing. Or at times when it's not unified, where it sounds really fractured, that's totally intentional.
Right.
That would be my short answer. How about for you?
Well, I think it's the consolation ultimately for me that is so completely rewarding. It's like it doesn't matter what Beethoven had to battle in his life. He found a way of giving us a sense of hope, whether it was in his strong, powerful music, or particularly, of course, in the slow movements.
I think I like that word consolation, and thinking specifically about the quartets, and not just the late quartets, but when one thinks about his deafness and the tremendous isolation that he felt as a result of that, it's so touching and consoling that he creates the means of close relationships between people. First of all, the players in a quartet, the degree of cooperation and of melding individual ideas together. How amazing that someone who had quite a lot of difficulty with his own relationships could provide this, that 250 years later, he's providing the opportunity for, first of all, for four people to sit down and communicate this music with each other, but then, of course, the relationships with the audiences, and even during these crazy times when we don't have live audiences, nonetheless, there's a powerful relationship even through a video and online.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's fascinating always that you find somebody like that who could not find resolution with almost anything in his life, and his life was essentially much more tragic than anything else, and yet his music. I mean, look at the last movement of 59-3.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that fugue. I mean, what is more of a celebration than that? There's nothing more dramatic, exciting, and celebrational, and it's very tender to think about how Beethoven could create a sense of resolution and triumph for all of us, but he never could really find it in himself, right?
Yeah, that's right. Do you have particularly fond concert memories of any of the quartets in particular venues or
we were very, very lucky. At the 25th anniversary of the Tokyo Quartet, which was in the 94-95 season, we played Beethoven cycles literally all over the world. At Carnegie Hall and Fisher Hall, we shared those two halls. We played one at La Scala Opera House.
Wow.
And yeah, and that I think was one of the most remarkable experiences of my life. 6 concerts, and we finally played for an encore at the end of it. We played the Cavatina from Opus 130 again, and you know, it really was impossible to hold back tears.
Yes.
It was so moving because the Italian audience would write to us after every concert. We'd get many letters backstage, thanking us and then asking us what we're going to play for an encore. And you felt that sense of unity. I think that's probably the most powerful experience I ever had on the stage. And there's another thought that I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but do you know how lucky we are? How many times have you played the Cavatina or the late Beethoven quartets or any of it? And how long have you known them?
Yeah.
And how long did Beethoven know them?
Right. It's a good point.
That's really unfair, isn't it?
That's no, I never thought of that.
For us to enjoy our whole lives, but he's deprived of them rather quick, presumably, although who knows?
I think it's what you said about it being a moving experience for the player is interesting because, of course, we spend so much of our time thinking about communicating emotion rather than necessarily, feeling that we shouldn't be too sort of obsessed with that. But I totally understand that with the Beethoven cycle. And I had that feeling of being pretty much in tears, slightly for a different reason when we got to the end of our cycle, which in London at the South Bank Centre, and we ended with the Grosse Fuge. And it's, as you know, it just demands so much of you, that piece. And I always feel like to play it well, you end up a little bit in little bits afterwards. You have to kind of reassemble yourself emotionally and physically. And and yet at the same time, the very ending of that piece is so glorious the way I can't really think of a more joyful, affirming ending.
Uplifting, completely uplifting, and yet people think the Grosse Fuge, oh my God, I'm scared of that. But that middle passage is so beautiful, full of yearning. Again, of course, in a major key. But
so I was very that time I really was very choked up on stage and felt a little bit embarrassed actually because I thought this isn't how it's supposed to be. But it's just a powerful experience. I
have to ask you about your book. Because I think it's the most wonderful book, Beethoven for a Later Age, which I think was you got that title from something very interesting. Tell me of the source.
Yeah, so the source was Beethoven himself when a violinist rather rudely said to him that the Opus 59 quartets were not music. Beethoven said, "They are not for you. This is music for a later age." So originally I wanted to have just music for a later age and then a subtitle about Beethoven. And embarrassing, the reason it became Beethoven for a later age has everything to do with Google search engines. And on a book about Beethoven, it needed to have Beethoven in the first part of the thing. So Beethoven for a later age works very well. It very much describes the themes that I'm talking about in the book.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and obviously it required a lot of somewhat research, but much more research really within yourself because it's a very personal book. Just explain a little bit for people who haven't yet read it. how you put this together, because it's really fascinating. There's a kind of duality throughout the book.
So it's a hybrid book, really. It started off with my obsession with Count Razumovsky, one of Beethoven's patrons, and the rather tragic life he had, actually, and the fact that we remember him because he commissioned these 3 quartets from Beethoven, and he also set up a string quartet in residence. And I got very interested in him and in the first players who tackled these works. And this was at a time, when I was also tackling the works early on, and it was reassuring for me to discover that I wasn't the only one who found them difficult. So I started to want to tell the story of the Takács quartet through our experiences with Beethoven. 59-3 was my audition piece, and they won the Portsmouth competition, now the London competition, before I joined, with 59-2. And there've been certain sort of pivotal moments in the quartet's history where Beethoven was prominent. So that was one element of it. But I also really wanted to try and tell the story of how the quartets came to be written, and stories about the first players, especially the violinist Ignaz Schuppenzich. So it is a mixture of history and memoir and stories about playing quartets together.
But the memoir part, let's not skip over that, because it's very, very compelling. I mean, to hear your entire story of like receiving the phone call and then traveling to Boulder for your audition. Am I remembering this somewhat correctly? And I mean, the way you spin the tale, the narrative is absolutely beautiful. I mean, you're a wonderful writer. It's incredible that you could play the violin and be that kind of a musician and write in that way too. It's a really beautiful book, and it tells an awful lot about Ed, and it tells an awful lot about the Takács quartet, and even more about Beethoven and the experiences of and how deeply meaningful these quartets are to all of us. Ed, I think some people might be falling asleep if we keep talking, although you and I probably could go on for a very long time.
All night, yeah.
We're delighted that you're performing Opus 18 number 6 and Opus 59 number 3 for a Beethoven celebration just around his birthday. We really appreciate that, and your whole quartet's commitment to everything you do. I'm a huge fan of the Takács quartet, always have been. And I remember hearing you, I don't know why, but I was in Amsterdam and you had a concert in the little Concertgebouw, and I snuck in and watched a little bit of the rehearsal, and you were playing the Dvorak Cypresses. Mm-hmm. And I looked and I went, now that is quartet playing. That is really beautiful.
Well, I have to say that's very kind, Peter, but we also are very grateful to you and the Colorado Music Festival during these tremendously challenging times for hosting us for our first concert back in the summer with our new violist, Richard O'Neill, and now having another wonderful opportunity to play more Beethoven. So thanks for everything that you and Colorado Music Festival are doing for musicians and for audiences around the world.
It's our great pleasure, Ed. We look forward very much to hearing you live very soon, hopefully even at the opening of next year's festival.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Ed, thank you so much for this. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for listening. And I hope you enjoyed our conversation. I can certainly say I enjoyed it very, very much. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks.